I want to tell you about the moment I understood that the map was older than the territory it described. I was sitting in a reading room at the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale in Florence, which is the kind of place where the light comes through high windows at an angle that makes everything look like evidence, and I was working through a collection of Portolan charts from the early 16th century. Portolan charts are navigational maps. They were made by mariners and cartographers from the 13th century onward, practical documents, tools for sailing, not decorative objects. They show coastlines, harbours, windroses, the things you need to get a ship from one port to another without running it into the ground. I was not looking for anything unusual. I was tracing a specific trade route for an entirely unrelated project. And then I turned a page and stopped. The coastline I was looking at was the southern coast of South America. The chart was dated, by the institution's own cataloguing, to approximately 1510. The southern tip of the continent, Tierra del Fuego, the passage between the Atlantic and Pacific, was rendered with a precision that I found, sitting in that reading room, genuinely difficult to account for. Not approximate, not roughly right, accurate in a way that the official history of European exploration of that coastline says should not have been possible in 1510. Magellan's circumnavigation, the first European voyage that would have produced this kind of detailed survey of that specific passage, did not begin until 1519, 9 years later. The chart I was looking at was either misdated, which happens, or it was copied from a source that should not have existed, which is a different kind of problem entirely. I sat with that for a while, and then I started pulling other charts. The official history of cartography is, on its surface, a coherent story. You learn about the ancient Greeks theorizing a spherical Earth, about Ptolemy's geography, about the Arab cartographers who preserved an extended classical knowledge through the medieval period, about the Portolan tradition emerging in the Mediterranean in the 13th century, about the great age of exploration gradually filling in the blank spaces, about Mercator and Ortelius systematizing the world into the projection we still use today. Each map explained by the voyages that preceded it, each coastline appearing on parchment only after a European ship had sailed along it, tidy, logical, reassuring. But the deeper I looked, the more that tidiness began to feel like a kind of performance, like a story told too smoothly. Because there is a class of maps, not one, not two, a specific identifiable class of historical maps that show things they should not be able to show. Coastlines that were not surveyed until centuries after the maps were drawn. Interior geography of continents European explorers had never penetrated. Astronomical alignments used as organizing principles that point to measurement systems far older than the maps themselves. Subglacial terrain under ice sheets that would not be confirmed by modern technology until the 20th century. These maps exist. They are in archives, they are catalogued, some of them are famous, and the official explanation for what they show does not, when you actually sit with the measurements, hold. Let me take you somewhere specific. In 1929, a Turkish naval officer named Halil Edhem was directing the conversion of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul into a museum. In the process of cataloguing the palace's collections, a researcher found a fragment, a map fragment painted on gazelle skin, dated by its own inscription to the year 919 in the Islamic calendar. Converted to the Gregorian calendar, that is 1513, the fragment belonged to a larger world map compiled by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. You may have heard of the Piri Reis map. It has a contested reputation, which is worth examining because the contestation itself is part of the pattern. What the Piri Reis map shows is this: the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of Europe and Africa on the east, the coasts of North and South America on the west. The South American coastline is rendered with a precision that produced when it was first seriously analysed in the 1960s by a professor of history at the United States Air Force Academy, named Charles Hapgood, something close to professional vertigo. Hapgood, working with cartographers and mathematicians, calculated that the longitudinal accuracy of the South American coastline on the Piri Reis map exceeded what should have been achievable with 16th century measurement technology. Longitude, the east-west coordinate, was the great unsolved problem of early modern navigation. It required precise timekeeping which the 16th century did not have. The marine chronometer that finally solved the longitude problem was not invented until 1762. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, shows longitudinal accuracy for the South American coastline that suggests access to measurement technology, or to source maps produced with measurement technology that should not have existed. But that is not the strangest thing the Piri Reis map shows. At the bottom of the map, below the tip of South America, there is a coastline, a continuous landmass rendered with the same care as the coastlines above it, labelled in Ottoman Turkish with notes about the climate and character of the terrain. The landmass is positioned where Antarctica is. The notes describe it as a warm country, with rivers, with animals. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. It was not seriously mapped until the 20th century. And the subglacial coastline, the actual shape of the continent beneath its ice sheet, was not confirmed until the seismic surveys and radar imaging of the 1950s and beyond. This raises a simple but critical question. The official explanation for the Antarctic coastline on the Piri Reis map is that it is a distorted rendering of the Patagonian coast, that the mapmaker ran out of space and bent the South American coastline back on itself. It is a reasonable hypothesis. It is the kind of explanation that closes a conversation efficiently, but it does not account for the specific features of the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map. It does not account for the river systems, the bays, the inlets, the coastal geography that correspond, when you overlay the map on modern subglacial survey data, with an accuracy that is uncomfortable to explain as a distortion of something else. Hapgood corresponded with the Cartography Department of the United States Air Force about this specific question. He received a letter which still exists in which the responding officer, a lieutenant colonel, stated that the accuracy of the Piri Reis map for certain portions of the southern coastline was, and I am quoting directly, inexplicable in terms of 16th century knowledge and technology. That letter was written in 1961. The silence around it has lasted 63 years, but the Piri Reis map is not alone. This is what the official account does not want you to hold in your mind at the same time. In 1531, 18 years after the Piri Reis map, a French mathematician and cartographer named Oronteus Finaeus published a world map. The Oronteus Finaeus map shows Antarctica, not as a speculative southern continent in the vague tradition of Terra Australis Incognita, which European mapmakers had been drawing as a theoretical balance for the northern land masses for centuries. It shows Antarctica in detail. It shows a continent with mountain ranges, river systems, bays, a central inland sea. It shows a coastline that in its broad outlines corresponds to the actual coastline of Antarctica beneath its ice. Now look at the Buache map. Philippe Buache was an 18th century French cartographer of considerable institutional standing, a member of the Académie Royale des Sciences. In 1737 he published a map of the Antarctic region. The Buache map shows Antarctica divided by a submerged seaway into two distinct landmasses. For 200 years this was considered simply wrong. Antarctica is one continent, not two. And then, in the 1950s, the seismic surveys conducted during the International Geophysical Year confirmed that beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, the continent is in fact divided by a subglacial trough into two distinct landmasses. The Buache map, drawn in 1737, shows a geographic feature that was not confirmed by modern technology until 1958. How? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the question. How does a Parisian cartographer drawing in 1737 accurately render the subglacial topography of a continent that was not discovered for another 80 years, and whose sub-ice geography was not measured for another 220? The official explanation is that Buache was drawing from theoretical speculation, that he proposed two landmasses as a hypothesis and happened by chance to be correct. Happened by chance to be correct about the specific subglacial topography of a continent nobody had seen. The silence around that explanation is deafening. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise. I am not claiming that these maps prove a lost civilization. I am claiming something more specific and in some ways more disturbing. I am claiming that these maps show evidence of source data, of measurements, of surveys, that the maps themselves are copies or compilations drawing on older material. Piri Reis said so explicitly. In the marginal notes he wrote on his own map, he stated that he had drawn from older source charts, some of them ancient, some from the library at Alexandria, some from sources he described only as coming from the time before. He named his sources the way a modern cartographer names a datum or a projection. He was working from something. What was he working from? Let me take you somewhere else. Hold the Antarctic question in your mind and travel north, to the Waldseemüller map of 1507. Martin Waldseemüller was a German cartographer who produced what is widely considered the first map to name the Americas, to depict them as a separate continent from Asia. Columbus had returned from his voyages in 1492. Vespucci had made his voyages in the late 1490s and early 1500s. European knowledge of the Western Hemisphere was 15 years old, and yet the Waldseemüller map shows the Pacific Ocean between the Americas and Asia. It shows the Americas as a distinct continent surrounded by ocean on both sides. The Pacific Ocean was not cited by a European, officially, until Balboa's crossing of the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, 6 years after Waldseemüller drew it. Waldseemüller also shows the west coast of South America in 1507. The west coast of South America was not explored by Europeans until Pizarro's expeditions in the 1520s. The geography shown corresponds with reasonable accuracy to the actual coastline. Waldseemüller, like Piri Reis, noted that he was working from older sources. He was describing a compilation, not an original survey. Someone had surveyed that coastline before the Europeans arrived. That someone is not in the official record. Now I want to show you something that the map historians handle very carefully. The class of maps I have been describing are not from one tradition or one region. They are not confined to the Ottoman or European cartographic lineage. There is a Chinese map, known from an 18th century copy but attributed to a 1418 original, that shows the Americas, the coastlines of Africa and Europe, and a southern continent. The debate about this map's authenticity is ferocious, which is itself worth noting, because the ferocity of the academic response to a map question is generally proportional to the severity of the implications. There is a Korean map from the 14th century, the Gangnedo, that shows Africa with its roughly correct shape 300 years before European cartographers had sailed its coast. There are Arab maps from the 9th and 10th centuries that show the sub-Saharan African coastline in configurations that match the modern coastline better than the European maps that followed them. What you are looking at, when you lay these maps side by side, is not a story of gradual discovery. It is a story of forgetting and partial recovery. The knowledge was there, earlier, in a form more complete than the official record acknowledges. And then something happened. And the knowledge that survived came through in fragments, in compilations, in maps whose makers acknowledged working from older sources without being able to name those sources, and without perhaps fully understanding what those sources represented. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The critical period the period during which the most anomalous maps were produced, the Piri Reis, the Oronteus Finaeus, the Waldseemüller, the Buache, falls roughly between 1500 and 1750. It is precisely the period during which European powers were establishing their claim to have discovered the world, to have mapped it, named it, claimed it. And it is precisely the period during which the maps they produced, some of them, the ones that draw on older sources, show a world that pre-exists that discovery, a world already surveyed, already measured, already known. The official explanation for the anomalous accuracy in these maps is almost always projection error, copying error, or fortunate coincidence. But coincidence cannot be applied infinitely. When a map drawn in 1513 shows accurate longitudinal positions for a continent whose longitude was not measurable with contemporary technology, that is one anomaly. When a map drawn in 1531 shows accurate subglacial Antarctic topography, that is a second. When a map drawn in 1507 shows an ocean not sighted by Europeans until 1513, that is a third. When a map drawn in 1737 shows a subglacial geographic feature not confirmed until 1958, that is a fourth. These anomalies do not cluster randomly. They cluster in a specific type of map. Maps drawn by cartographers who explicitly cited older source material. That clustering is evidence of something. Evidence of what exactly is the question that the official record has decided not to pursue. Let me tell you about something I found in the Habsburg Imperial Archives in Vienna, not in the restricted collections, in the open stacks, which is sometimes where the most consequential things sit, because accessibility and invisibility are not mutually exclusive. A collection of survey notes from the late 16th century, compiled by a Flemish cartographer working in the service of the emperor, contains a set of references to what the compiler describes as the ancient mappings. He uses a specific Latin phrase, mappae antiquissimae, the most ancient maps, and he distinguishes them from the maps of the Greeks, which he knew well, and from the Arab geographical tradition, which he also cites. He refers to the mappae antiquissimae as a distinct category, a body of material predating both. He says he consulted them for his rendering of the northern coastlines, the coastlines of what is now northern Russia and the Arctic, approaches. He does not say where he found them. He does not describe their physical form. He refers to them as if their existence requires no explanation, as if they are simply known to people in his position to exist. I went looking for those maps, in the places where they should logically be, if they exist. The Hofbibliothek, the Vatican cartographic collections, the archival remnants of the various geographical societies of the late Renaissance period. I did not find them. What I found instead was the shape of their absence, references to older sources in a dozen different cartographic traditions, each reference gesturing towards something prior, something the mapmaker was drawing from without being able or willing to fully identify. The source references converge. They point toward the same general category of earlier material, and the material itself is gone. Where did it go? Let me suggest something that I want you to hold carefully, as a possibility rather than a claim. The critical period I described, 1500 to 1750, is also the period of maximum institutional consolidation of geographic knowledge. The period when the great European geographic societies were established, when maps moved from being private commercial and naval documents into official state records, when cartography became a formal academic and governmental discipline. The period when, in other words, the story of who knew what about the world and when was officially written down and fixed. Before that period, maps were produced by individuals or small workshops working from whatever material they could access, including older material of uncertain provenance. After that period, maps were produced within institutional frameworks that had an investment in the narrative of progressive European discovery. The anomalous maps, the ones that show things that shouldn't be there, cluster almost entirely in the transitional period. In the decades when the old sources were still being consulted, but the new institutional framework was not yet fully in place to manage what those sources implied. And then the sources disappear. Not all at once. Gradually. Reference by reference, cited less frequently, then rarely, then not at all. By the 18th century, the cartographic tradition that acknowledges older sources has effectively ended. The official history of geographic knowledge begins with the Greeks, runs through the European age of exploration, and there is nothing before, nothing parallel, nothing that the official tradition cannot account for. The silence was deafening. I want to talk about a specific coastline, because the coastline is where the argument becomes concrete in a way that cannot be dismissed. The northern coastline of Russia, the Arctic coast from the Kola Peninsula to the Bering Strait, is shown on certain 16th and 17th century maps with an accuracy that should not be possible. This coastline was not systematically surveyed by modern methods until the late 18th and 19th centuries. The Great Northern Expedition, the massive Russian naval survey that produced the first reliable modern charts of the Siberian Arctic coast, ran from 1733 to 1743. And yet maps produced 150 years earlier show specific geographic features of that coastline, peninsulas, major river mouths, the broad configuration of the Arctic bays that match the modern survey data, with an accuracy that exceeds what intermittent coastal trading contacts should have produced. Who surveyed the Arctic coast of Siberia before the Russians surveyed the Arctic coast of Siberia? The territories shown on those maps are the same territories that appear on 16th and 17th century European maps labelled Tartaria, the vast spaces between the Urals and the Pacific. The enormous landmass that European cartographers shaded in and marked with the words Magna Tartaria, Great Tartary, using the word as a placeholder for something they could not categorize. A territory that was clearly not empty, since they showed cities in it and labelled rivers and marked coastlines, but that they could not explain in terms of the civilizational frameworks they had for the rest of the world. The cartographers who labelled Tartaria were not guessing. They were copying from sources that showed a populated, navigated, surveyed territory. And those sources pointed to a tradition of geographic knowledge emanating from precisely the region that the official record most consistently describes as having contained nothing worth knowing about. What was in that territory? What surveyed those coastlines? What produced the source material that Piri Reis and Oronteus Finaeus and the Flemish cartographer in Vienna were drawing from without being able to explain where it came from? The official record says nomads and empty steppe. The maps say something else entirely. Here is where it becomes impossible to ignore in a way I find genuinely disturbing. The anomalous maps are not random. They do not scatter evenly across the cartographic tradition. They cluster around specific moments and specific figures. And when you trace those figures, when you follow the citations and the provenance notes and the archival references, back as far as they go, you arrive repeatedly at the same period, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, and the same geography, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea region, the networks of commercial and intellectual exchange that ran between the Byzantine world, the Arab geographical tradition, and the early European maritime powers. Something passed through those networks, a body of geographic knowledge, old, comprehensive, precise. And it arrived in the hands of the Piri Reises and the Waldseemüllers in fragments, in pieces, in source maps that the recipients could use but could not fully explain or attribute. They copied what they had. They noted that it was ancient. And then they moved on, and then the fragments themselves disappeared into the fires and floods and political upheavals and deliberate archival clearances of the intervening centuries, leaving behind only the copies. The maps we have are the shadows of something larger. The coastlines that shouldn't be there are the traces of surveys we have not been told were taken. I keep returning to something Piri Reis wrote. In the notes on his own map describing his sources, he mentions charts that he says dated from the time of Alexander the Great, charts that had been preserved in the Library of Alexandria, survived its destruction in fragmentary form, passed through Arab geographical collections, and eventually arrived in Ottoman hands. He was describing a transmission chain, a body of knowledge that had travelled across 2,000 years and multiple civilizations before reaching his work table in 1513. He drew from it without, apparently, finding its existence remarkable. It was simply material he had, that had been collected and preserved and passed along. What else was in that transmission chain that we have lost? What portions of the ancient geographical knowledge did not survive the journey? What coastlines were accurately surveyed and recorded and then lost before any cartographer could copy them? The evidence suggests something much larger than what the official history of cartography is willing to accommodate. Not a conspiracy, not a deliberate erasure, something more melancholy than that. The ordinary catastrophe of information loss, the normal entropy of knowledge across time. A tradition so old and so widely distributed that when its transmission was interrupted, it left behind only these traces, these edges of accuracy in maps whose makers could no longer explain why the coastlines were right. But here is the question I cannot stop asking. If the knowledge was this complete, if someone once knew the shape of Antarctica beneath its ice, if someone once surveyed the Arctic coastline of Siberia with the precision that appears in those 16th century maps, if someone mapped the Pacific coast of South America before Europeans arrived, what else did they know? Not just geography. What knowledge of materials, of engineering, of astronomical measurement was carried alongside the geographic knowledge in that same tradition? What was built by the hands that held those maps? I think about the churches, the identical churches in Kazan and Philadelphia, the proportional logic repeated across 10,000 miles of ocean and steppe and mountain range. I think about the buildings that predate themselves, the foundations that go deeper than they should. And I think about what it would mean if the civilization that built those buildings was the same civilization that surveyed those coastlines. If the body of knowledge was not divided the way we divide knowledge now, into geography and architecture and astronomy and engineering, but was one integrated system, a way of knowing the world that expressed itself simultaneously in the shape of a building and the rendering of a coastline and the alignment of a cathedral to the angle of a sunrise on a specific morning in late autumn. A civilization that had measured the world so completely that it left its measurements in stone in every city and on parchment in every archive, and then fell silent, and left the measurements standing, waiting for someone to understand what they were looking at. I go back to that reading room in Florence sometimes, in my mind. I go back to the chart with the southern coastline that shouldn't be accurate in 1510, and I try to imagine the hands that made the source map, the person who stood or sailed or worked through some system of calculation at the edge of the known world and drew the southern passage correctly. Who were they? What did they call themselves? What language did they speak when they recorded that coastline? What did they understand that we have not been told they understood? We don't know. The official record doesn't tell us, because the official record was built on top of the knowledge, not from it. It was written in the period when the sources were already fading, already fragmenting, already becoming something that cartographers cited without being able to explain. The institutional frameworks that fix the official story of geographic knowledge were built precisely in the decades when those older sources were disappearing. The story that was fixed was the story that the sources were gone, and so the story and the disappearance confirmed each other, and the loop closed, and what remained was an official history of cartography with a very specific shape, progressive, European, beginning with the Greeks, and a very specific absence at its centre. The maps that didn't fit were catalogued and filed and left to sit in reading rooms where the light comes through high windows at the angle that makes everything look like evidence. The map is older than the territory it describes. The survey was taken before the discovery. The coastline was known before the ship arrived. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a geography encoded in these maps that predates everything we have been told about the history of human knowledge of this planet. It is precise, it is consistent, it is worldwide, and it is officially not there. The deeper I went, the more clearly I could see the outline of something vast and lost and extraordinarily competent. A civilization that had measured the earth with instruments we cannot identify, that had recorded those measurements in a form durable enough to pass through 2,000 years of transmission, and that left in the margins of a Turkish admiral's map, drawn on gazelle skin in 1513, its most indelible trace. A coastline that shouldn't be there. I'm still reading.